Hello again, people, and today we are going to talk about everyone's favorite introverted, dualistic pluralism prankster, Kris Dreemurr. This video kicks off a brand new series where I am going to be tackling the entire main cast of Deltarune, who they are, what they want, and potentially where they will find themselves in the story's conclusion. Throughout each of these videos, I will amass and analyze everything we know about the character so far, and along the way, maybe we can hope to understand them better. Before we begin, yes, I understand that Deltarune is barely completed, and anything that we can discern from the first two chapters could very well be recontextualized upon the other chapter's release. If this does end up happening due to some sort of story twist or plot point, then I shall make a follow-up video to account for this upon the game's release. I'll sprinkle in some theories throughout here and there, but this is purely a character analysis series. Kris has always given me a fascination with who they are. To be more accurate, who they were. At first, Kris in our eyes is just your typical silent protagonist who we can use to interact with the game. Thanks to several context clues, the community has not only discerned that Kris has a previous history, but also the way in which Kris is acting right now is counter to the way they acted in the past. Noelle is what informs us most regarding this previous history. Given all this extra information, the community has also discerned that the player is a separate entity to Kris. I have broken this video down into three main parts: the past, the present, and the future. Each of the videos in this series will follow a similar format. The titles of these sections are self-explanatory, as they describe who the character was prior to the events of Deltarune Chapter 1, how they respond to the events of the game so far, and, by knowing all of this, potentially theorizing about what the future holds for the respective character. Due to the nature of each character, I will have more to say in some sections compared to others. For example, Kris will potentially have the biggest past section out of all the other characters. Without further ado, let's explore the story of Kris Dreemurr. The friendship between Noelle Holliday and Kris Dreemurr gives us a wealth of knowledge regarding who Kris was prior to the events of Deltarune. From entries in the Spamton sweepstakes, we know that Kris used to spend time at Noelle's house very often, seemingly just the two of them. While I am not completely ruling out the alternative of Noelle spending time at the Dreemurr household, it does seem like more often than not, it was Kris that spent time with Noelle. I am intrigued at the reasoning of why this was the norm rather than a mix between. Noelle makes the assumption that Kris wanted to come over because they simply wanted to play the piano at her house. Noelle at times also questions if Kris even comes over for her sake, rather than to just use the piano. An idea I would disagree with for one big reason. Whenever Noelle would come close and listen to Kris play, Kris would immediately stop and come back to join her. The way Noelle describes the events in this post, it seems like at times, Noelle would just leave Kris to their own devices and listen to them as they play the piano, sometimes for hours on end. This all seems very strange, but I think we can find a passable answer. Disclaimer: not a psychologist, not a professional, just making conclusions on research I have conducted. What would compel Kris to play the piano for hours on end? Noelle describes Kris's behavior as suddenly stopping. Noelle describes that Kris would suddenly stop out of nowhere and stare off into space, as if they were remembering something. There's actually a term for this, it's called an absence seizure. I used to get these when I was younger. Absence seizures usually occur in children aged 4 to 14. It's a short-term period of time where someone stares blankly in no particular direction. They're completely involuntary. You're just sitting down or standing, minding your own business, not doing anything that requires too much thought, and suddenly it's just like all of the lights in your head get turned off. From what I've gathered, there is no explanation for them aside from abnormal brain activity. Also, you'll get a kick out of this. The test that's used to monitor brain activity is called an egg test. Egg with 2 E's. It's called an electroencephalogram. Sheesh, that's a big word. This doesn't really have anything to do with my theory, I just thought it was pretty funny. Absence seizures have also been known to link to stress, and after learning everything I could possibly learn about Kris, I would say that Kris has a very stressful life. In the library, we see there is a book titled How to Care for Humans, and upon reading the back, it says that Toriel had withdrawn the book multiple times in the past. Assuming the book has a general knowledge about humans, we could assume that Toriel has a similar level of knowledge that we do, albeit with some gaps. Perhaps Toriel simply chalked this behavior up to stress, and to give Kris a way to make themselves feel better, they had Kris learn to play the piano. Learning to play an instrument can be known to help alleviate stress, but until you solve the actual source of that stress, you're gonna find yourself in a putting a band-aid on a scar situation. Stress could very well be a contributing factor to why Kris is having irregular brain activity, but it seems that whatever is causing the stress was never taken care of, or processed, if this is continuing to happen multiple times. The most notable culprit of Kris's stress would have to be the passing or the abandonment of Kris's original parents. Clearly, Kris is an orphan in a small town filled with people that are not of their own kind. Kris is alone in more ways than one. Being raised in this manner would have been accompanied by its own set of challenges for parent and child alike. Then, couple that with the effects of divorce, would spell a recipe for a lot of stress. Psychological trauma from divorce can be mitigated in children by taking the necessary steps. Examples include communication, support, making sure that the kids are not caught in the middle of disagreements, etc. Unfortunately, after seeing the way that Toriel acts towards Asgore, I do not think any communication has transpired. I'm not saying that Toriel is a bad mother or anything. She clearly loves Kris and Azrael, but I am saying with the way that she is presented so far, she seems like she is just ignoring her problems, and this denial is having an effect on her children. To be as fair as I possibly can, we still don't know what transpired to prompt the divorce, but unless it was something genuinely terrible that Asgore did, I really can't excuse how Toriel simply tries to ignore Asgore. Asgore clearly still loves Toriel, and when he asks Kris if they want to go have dinner when Azrael comes home, it seems like he regrets the divorce. Toriel seems to have nothing but contempt for Asgore, and she's not afraid to show it. Visiting Asgore in Chapter 1, he gives Kris a bouquet of flowers for Toriel. If you give them to Toriel, as requested, she almost looks like she's insulted. Leaving and coming back, it's hinted that she immediately threw them into the garbage. In Chapter 2, we see that Toriel and Asgore happen to cross each other at the supermarket. Asgore tries to strike up a conversation about the same topic he tried to bring up to Kris, but Toriel hurries out, postponing the conversation to when Azrael comes home. It's very clear that Toriel doesn't want anything to do with Asgore. She is civil and nice, but it seems like she is reluctant to even carry on a conversation. She also seems to refrain from explaining to Kris how she feels about the flowers. It's very clear that Toriel is happier now that she is divorced, but Asgore is not. He is trying to rekindle old flame but is unsuccessful. I can't help but think that the reason why he's still trying is because Toriel has not properly conveyed how she feels. Admittedly, it is difficult to tell someone that you don't love them anymore and you probably never will love them again, especially after raising 2 children with them, but it is a conversation that needs to happen. There is always the possibility that Toriel did have this conversation and Asgore simply doesn't want to listen and respect Toriel's wishes, but the reason why I think the conversation didn't happen is because the way Toriel reacts to the flowers. In the supermarket scene, Asgore offers Toriel more flowers, but instead of denying them, she pretends that she's busy and she has to leave. She is ignoring the problem, hoping it goes away. When Kris gives Toriel the flowers, this would be a perfect opportunity for Toriel to talk to Kris about the divorce. This would have been a great time to explain to her child why she doesn't love their father anymore, or at the very least, communicate that whatever happened, A, wasn't Kris's fault, and B, would never come between her and Kris. Both of these things are very real fears that children have when their parents split up. Another example of Toriel not properly communicating with Kris would be the headband. She references a red headband that had horns on it, which Kris would wear constantly. Toriel bought this headband because at one point Kris asked her when their horns would grow in. This story only reinforces Toriel's poor communication skills. It's nice that Toriel wanted to accommodate Kris's wishes, but the way it sounds, I don't think Toriel ever explained to Kris that they were never going to grow in. Again, yes, this would be a difficult conversation to have, but if this conversation didn't happen, then it could have led to some resentment. This seems obvious to us, but remember, Kris grew up in a town that was filled with nothing but monsters. Kris probably just assumed that they looked slightly different from their parents, but eventually they would grow fur and horns just like them. If this conversation didn't happen, Kris would have had to find out that they were a human all on their own. It could have been at any time. When they were reading a book and saw pictures of humans inside it, when they saw a group of humans visiting town one day, while they were watching TV, or maybe it suddenly came to them when they were sitting in class. Or maybe it was around the time when they were visiting Noelle, and all that was going through Kris's head afterwards were, why didn't my family tell me? Now of course, you could always argue that they did tell Kris, But as the story has been presented so far, I don't believe that's the case. I think Kris had to figure it out all by themselves, and when they did, they felt awful. They felt like they had been lied to their entire life. Potentially, they even felt angry with their parents for just letting them continue to think that their horns would grow in. Now that we've gone over the meaty bits of Kris's past, I think I'll wrap things up with a speed round of things we know. Kris for a time was also known as a mischievous prankster. Their pranks included climbing up into the Holiday's light fixture, hiding under Noelle's bed, putting ketchup on their arm to trick Noelle to think it was blood. As far as I can tell, these could have just been instances of Kris acting out. We don't have a lot of context for these events aside from the way they are recounted by other people. From the way they described these occurrences, it seemed like these pranks were just par for the course when it came to dealing with Kris. But above all else, harmless. I suspect we will get a lot more context on Kris's behavior when the game officially releases, which could be sooner than expected. Another past behavior pattern of Kris so subtle that it's mentioned in a single dialogue option: Kris and Caddy used to study the occult together. This could mean anything really, from a hobby of fascination all the way to the event that kicks off the story of Deltarune itself. And finally we get to the event seemingly only a few months before the events of Deltarune, in which Kris was targeted and bullied by Susie. We'll go more into Susie's potential reasons for why she did what she did in her video, but for now we'll just talk about Kris's reaction to her behavior. I have already made a theory about why Kris doesn't mind Susie picking on them in a separate video. If you want to watch that one, it's in the description, or the pinned comment. Cliff Notes version: Kris understands that Susie feels like an outcast and she doesn't get enough attention from her parental figures, and Kris identifies with this. Kris values Susie's life because Kris understands how Susie feels. This understanding could also grow beyond just family issues. It could also be stemming from sibling issues. Well, there you have it, everything we know about Kris's past up until the events of Chapter 1. We still have a lot more to go over. I'm only 2,000 words into the script and I haven't even started the game yet. Let's keep it going. This entire section is going to be accompanied by its own set of caveats. Due to the nature of Kris's state within the story of Deltarune, it is almost impossible to confirm that Kris has any say in the events of the story, with a few exceptions. We the player are controlling Kris and have agency when it comes to how the game is played. Because of this, we can only really analyze a small number of choices that are out of our control, such as actions that take place within cutscenes. We don't have control of Kris during this time, so we can only assume that Kris, or an outside force independent of the player, is moving Kris. But for the sake of consistency for this video, I will assume that every time Kris moves without the player doing it for them is Kris themselves. The first event we'll talk about is subtle, so subtle most people don't even see it. Right at the beginning, as the intro music is playing, Toriel drives Kris to school and holds out her hand to take Kris inside. Kris holds Toriel's hand, but they also hold their head down, almost as if they are embarrassed. Now at first, I thought this was just a small detail to give some more charm to the scene, but it turns out there's a reason why Kris is so embarrassed. They are embarrassed because they know that Susie is watching them. This is actually semi-confirmed later when Susie takes a jab at Kris, claiming they need someone to hold their hand. The first assumption would be that Toriel's affection makes Kris feel embarrassed, either generally or because they know that Susie is watching them. We'll get to the potential jealousy implications in Susie's video. Kris is a human in a monster town. No doubt they are self-conscious about how different they look compared to their parents, and I think it's safe to say that at this point they have already figured out that they are not a monster. Perhaps it is simply that they are insecure when Toriel displays affection to them. Perhaps it is not even that convoluted of an explanation. Maybe Kris is just embarrassed because they are a teenager and it's not cool for their mom to hold their hand when they walk inside the school. This next section will cover moments from chapters 1 and 2, so we'll be jumping around a bit. This is mainly because I'm talking about a trend when it comes to Kris within cutscenes. More specifically, their lack of action within them. There are many instances in Deltarune's cutscenes where Kris is in peril. Whether they are picked up, leaned on, or fall from a great height, Kris's lack of action is consistent for the most part. Susie picks up Kris and threatens them, but they do nothing. Sure, you could argue that they know that Susie would never really hurt them, but what about the Spade King? The Spade King would absolutely hurt Kris given the chance, and he almost does. Kris probably doesn't have the strength to break free on their own in this scene, but they aren't even trying. Then of course you have the end of chapter 2 when Kris, Rousey, and Susie are all captured by Queen. Kris's inaction is even more deliberate. Rule of 3 would support that this is a deliberate choice by Toby Fox. I'm just hard pressed as to why. Why does Kris not struggle even when they are in potential danger? The way I see it, there could be numerous reasons for this with varying degrees of plausibility. Fair warning, some of these interpretations will get a little dark, so sorry in advance. The first idea that comes to mind is that Kris doesn't want to struggle. As much as it pains me to say, this may very well be because Kris doesn't care if they survive. Like I previously went over, Kris has a lot of baggage to deal with at such a young age, so I wouldn't blame them for buckling a bit under the pressure. I'm not saying definitively that Kris wants to die, but when there's so much going on in your life, maybe the idea of not having to live it anymore can be a little too tempting. People often have a misconception about what depression is, what it actually feels like. Depression is not just feeling really sad. Depression makes you feel empty. Depression makes you feel nothing. Depression can get to a point where you feel so bad you just stop feeling altogether. It's like your brain's emotions shut down just to protect you. In times like this, it can be hard to knock somebody out of this state, even if you threaten them with mortal harm. The other interpretation is a little more meta. This particular interpretation relies on the player controlling Kris theory being 100% true for it to work. So for now, let's just say it is. Kris is being controlled by the player and they have to know this. Maybe they don't know exactly who is controlling them, but the point is, Kris is pretty smart and they realize at this point that their world has profound properties that are akin to a video game. Kris is not inclined to defend themselves because at this point they are aware that death is just a setback. They know that if Susie did bite their face off in visceral fashion, they would just simply return to their previous save state. It's kind of like that one movie trope where they relive the same day over and over again, and the later half of the film, the main character becomes numb to the thought of dying. Kris had been playing this game, or even played this game already, but we are taking the used console and putting our own save file, picking up from where Kris's last save was. Think back to the time you played Deltarune for the first time and Susie was threatening Kris. You were probably worried about Kris's safety. But now looking back with the knowledge you have, you probably watch that scene and react just as nonchalantly as Kris does, because you know what's going to happen. This interpretation can be further supported by Kris's next action. During this cutscene, when Kris is prompted to walk inside the closet, they back away. The first and more simpler reason for this is because Kris is simply afraid of the dark. The more meta interpretation is that they know what's about to happen. Kris has seen the inside of a dark world before, which is supported by their save file already being there. Upon entering the dark world, there is a long stretch of time where we play as Kris. We make choices, we defeat enemies, but for the most part, everything that happens is the result of the player's direct control. Kris and the player are separate entities, meaning that the wishes of one and the other vary significantly. Like I said, unless Kris makes an active motion without the player's input, we will not be counting any of these events as falling under Kris's wishes. Not until the Spade King boss fight does Kris move independently again. I said it before and I'll say it again, this is my favorite cutscene so far. The Spade King betrays the Lightners after Rousey heals them, and right before the king is about to attack Susie again, Kris leaps forth and saves her. We'll probably never know for sure if this would have been a fatal blow. After all, Susie does have the highest health pool in the group, but that's irrelevant. The point is, this is an active choice from Kris. This is what they want, and this is also one of the biggest pieces of character development for Kris so far. Despite everything that's happened, despite everything Susie did, Kris moves to protect her. Susie had made Kris the focal point of her rage, which manifested in her behavior. Even before the events of Deltarune, we're talking insults, threats, hurtful words. Even in the Dark World, Susie continues to make Kris's life more difficult. Whether you play pacifist or aggressive, Susie's rash actions make the game more difficult. Not incredibly difficult, but still very much so. Kris stands by who they are, whether we control them or not. Susie can be obnoxious, rude, arrogant, or just plain old mean, but she is still a person. If Kris is able, they will always help someone within their power to help. Kris is absolutely my favorite character. Now we get to the epilogue, and in this section we'll actually talk about both instances of where Kris, let's just call these episodes, instances where Kris's movement change and they appear to acknowledge the player as well as want to open up dark fountains. After everything we have gone over, I believe I can say with certainty that these instances are Kris being possessed. Yes, I know some of you might not agree, but just hear me out. If you still disagree with me by the time I'm done with my argument, I would love to hear any counter evidence you might have that I might have missed. The way I see it, Kris has 3 different movement styles. The first is that of the player. We move Kris in any direction we so please, and in doing so, we also have the ability to interact with the world, pick up items, and get rid of items. The second form is not within the player's control, and remains solely within cutscenes. Kris autonomously walks into Toriel's car. They walk to class, they back away from the dark world in the supply closet, etc. This type of movement is identical to the first kind of movement, with the only difference is we have no control over it. In any typical video game, no one would bat an eye at this type of movement because it is commonplace in video games. No one questions why their character is being moved without them because they are aware that this is a video game, and the cutscene probably requires some repetitive or complex movement that doesn't need the player's input. This isn't your typical video game, however. This is Deltarune. The tiebreaker between these two types of movement is the third one, the one that consistently seeks to remove the soul. Kris moves at a slower pace. The frames in the walking animation skip, almost as if Kris is moving at a lower frame rate than the game itself. During this type of movement, Kris moves independently, but here, the key difference is the soul is outside of the body. I am highlighting all of these different movement patterns to show you that all of them have a different source, and the crux of my argument comes from the end of Chapter 1. As most of you know at this point, when the red soul is thrown into the birdcage, if you press the arrow keys, the soul moves as well. The red soul is directly connected to us, the player. Because of this, we know for a fact we have no influence on the third type of movement. By analyzing Kris's actions during this third type of movement, we can discern that this is not what Kris would want. At the end of Chapter 2, Toriel has to call the police because her tires have been slashed. It is highly implied that it was Kris who did the slashing. Kris cares about Toriel, obviously, because she is their mother. Imagine what would happen if the next morning Toriel had to leave the house in a hurry. So quickly, she didn't realize the tires had been slashed, and when she was pulling away, she lost control of the vehicle and ended up hurting herself. If you really think that this is Kris doing this, just think to yourself for a moment. Would Kris really endanger Toriel's life? Also, just think, if Kris truly just wanted Susie to stay a little while longer, all they would have to do is just ask Toriel. I am almost 100% sure she would have just said yes. Remember in Chapter 1 how ecstatic she was as she learned that Kris found a new friend? She went from so angry she was going to punish Kris to, okay, it's alright, just go to bed a little early tonight. This third entity doesn't care about Kris, or Toriel for that matter, and saw a fitting opportunity to get what they want by any means necessary. Within cutscenes, Kris moves independently, but Kris's movements are normal. These instances all fall under the second form of movement, out of the player's control, but walking normally, all frames accounted for. During the third type of movement, Kris slows, almost as if they are being told to take one step at a time, almost as if Kris is following a specific form of instructions, almost as if Kris is adhering to instructions from a line of code. Really quick, while I have time, let me tell you about a game called Alcor, amazingly underrated game that has a lot of Undertale inspiration. Partly through the game, you learn about coding. Long story short, coding is just typing out a long list of instructions that a computer or a program must follow. All of Kris's movements appear like they are stemming from a list of instructions. Move forward, move forward, move forward, stop, raise arm, remove soul, throw soul at birdcage_object. You get the picture. This entire world is a game simulated on our computers. so why would we assume that it works any differently than a computer world? You should totally play Alcor, by the way. It's 100% free, it was made by one person, and it has a very compelling story. And that is pretty much it for the present actions of Kris. Yes, there are a few subtle movements like recoiling back during the Spanton cutscene or moving closer to Noelle when Queen is trying to figure out who she is, but for the most part, these movements are self-explanatory. I didn't bother analyzing these scenes because I think it's pretty much universally agreed upon what these scenes mean. Spamton startles Kris, and Kris doesn't want Noelle to be found out by Queen. And now we look to the future. I'm not here today to claim that I know what the future will bring. For all I know, Kris is the Knight, and they are trying to destroy the world because they hate the world or something. I truly hope that isn't the case, and I highly doubt that will happen, but whatever does happen, we could assume a few things. For starters, Kris will continue to look out for Susie, and vice versa. The Dark Fountains will continue to pop up, and some of them may evidently be made by Kris themselves. Kris, at some point, will have to face their past. They are human, and they will come to terms with this. They need to, and hopefully will sit down and have a serious conversation with their mother. This will probably happen around Chapter 3. I also feel like a conversation with Azrael is in order. It's clear that they used to spend a lot of time together, but ever since Azrael left for college, Kris and Azrael haven't been able to speak with each other. Kris will get their chance to make peace with their human heritage. They probably won't meet their biological parents, but they will come to terms with who they are. And there you have it, a full as it can be character analysis of Kris Dreemurr. Next time, we'll delve into the mysterious and potentially depressing world of Susie, the violent tormentor. Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a quick moment to touch base about the audio quality of my last video. It wasn't very good, and if I'm being honest with myself, a lot of my previous Deltarune theories have suffered from subpar audio quality. I finally decided to take the necessary steps to prevent that from happening in the near future. For starters, I got a new CPU cooler. My previous one was a all-in-one liquid cooler that had air bubbles in it, and I just couldn't get the air bubbles out for the life of me. So whenever I turned on my computer, it would make a sound like this. I have since replaced it with a much quieter Noctua air cooler, and I must say I am very happy with my purchase. From now on, I will also be taking the necessary steps to create backups of my audio should I ever make an error while editing the audio. Something I absolutely should have been doing from the beginning. And the last step, obviously the most important step, is I'm going to be a lot less lazy when editing my audio from now on. Because admittedly, I have been pretty lazy when it comes to my audio editing. As of recording this, I just passed 2,300 subscribers, so I'm gonna have to start raising my standards. Otherwise, what the heck are people even subscribing to? If you have any recommendations for how I can improve my audio quality more, I would love to hear them. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.